Shalom. Good morning, everybody. There's a story in the Talmud I've been thinking a lot about this past week. It's a story of a rabbi named Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. He was 17 or 18 years old when there was a crisis in the community, and he was called into leadership in this moment of incredible need in the Jewish community. But Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah knew what he didn't know, and he was really afraid of leading given his lack of experience and his youth. And so he stayed up all night and he said to his wife, I just don't know what to do. I'm not ready for this. And then when he woke up after a couple of hours of sleep the next morning, he looked out and saw that God had blessed him by giving him a couple of white hairs in his beard so that he would appear a little bit older and he would look to have a little bit more gravitas. And something extraordinary happened because with that white hair, he also saw things that he had never seen before in Torah verses that he had said and studied his entire life. It was as if in one night, he gained the understanding of a lifetime. Suddenly, he said he was as wise as a 70-year-old. He said, Harei ani kaven shiv'im shana. I'm now like one who's 70 years old. You might recognize part of this story because it appears in our Haggadah. It comes originally from the Talmud. And the reason I've been thinking about it is because many of us feel over these past 2 weeks like we are growing many years in the space of only a couple of days. Like our understanding of the world is changing and growing at such a rapid pace. Just before Shabbat, I published an article in which I articulated some of the ways that I feel that I have grown years in a matter of days. And I want to share some of that thinking with you now, also a little bit fleshed out and with a little bit of Torah as a frame for us. So we know that the murder of George Floyd was an absolute revelation for white America. We know that the image of a man lying on the street for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, his body limp beneath the officer's knee, transfixed and has the potential to transform a nation. There was something about witnessing the breath of life being pulled out of a man's body so casually. When we watched that video, which by the way was shot by a 17-year-old girl, could you imagine a child having the presence of mind to know in that moment, to take out her phone and to have the courage to shoot that video and then to share it afterwards? But when we witnessed that video, we didn't see one perpetrator and one victim. What we saw was the perverseness and the pervasiveness of racism in this country in full view. We saw the veil pulled back on 4 centuries of state-sanctioned brutality, this multi-generational, systematic and systemic effort to suppress and to control Black people and Black bodies. This is not a new story for America, of course, but as Michael Ellenberg has been saying over the last week or two, it's like we're all sitting now in this national teach-in on race and racism, in part because there's no sports and there's no other entertainment. So we're reading books, which is generally something I would advise anyway, but especially now, people are picking up Ta-Nehisi Coates. They're reading Brian Stevenson and Michelle Alexander and Ibram X. Kendi and Khalil Gibran Muhammad. These people have been writing and teaching for many years about white supremacy, about entrenched predatory self-interest, which sits at the roots of our systems of policing and punishment in America. But now we're seeing this, many of us with our own eyes. Many of us are seeing it on the streets. Many of us are seeing it from our homes. We can tell that this moment is different, that something in this moment has shifted. NASCAR and the Marine Corps both just banned the use of Confederate flags. The NFL this past week apologized for its position opposing kneeling during the national anthem. And I don't know anything about football, and I won't pretend to, but it does seem to me like a really big contract for Colin Kaepernick would be a really good way to lock in that apology right now. But something's changing. Am I right, Paul? Yes? Something's changing. Something's shifting in this moment. And this moment is transforming into a movement. And I don't know exactly why. Maybe it's because there's no NBA. Maybe it's because we can't go out to the movies. Maybe it's because of the powerful and unique confluence of crises, what I was calling a couple of days ago a trifecta of crises, but it's much more than a trifecta. We're living now through a crisis of democracy, through a profound national global health crisis, and through an economic crisis, all of that on top of the environmental crisis. And as the foundation, at the foundation, the crisis of racism, or as my friend Reverend Otis Moss calls it, COVID-16-19. We're not just living through COVID-19. Maybe it's because of the horror of that video. We can't avoid the horrible truth. Maybe it's because so many police officers in so many cities around the country, including here in Los Angeles, were caught responding to nonviolent protests against police brutality, with the same kind of excessive force that people were in the streets protesting against. And that excessive force did more than any clever sign or carefully crafted sermon could do to wake the country up. Maybe it was a combination of all of those factors, but for some reason, this moment has led so many people around this country and around the world to open our hearts and minds at the same time. People are really listening right now. Last week, my friend Lisa Sharon Harper put together an extraordinary collection of some of the most amazing faith leaders in the country. And she put on a national town hall on policing and law enforcement with Freedom Road, her organization. Some of you probably tuned in and heard it. I was invited to sit on a panel with Reverend Jim Wallace, who told this very simple story. He shared that when he was a child, he had a Black friend who told him that his mother's instruction to him were very clear. If he ever got lost and he saw a police officer coming toward him, he was to hide until the officer passed by and then come out and ask someone else for help. And Jim Wallace was astonished by this because his own white mother had told him exactly the opposite message. If you ever get lost, look for a police officer. That's someone you know you can trust. The last few weeks have made it absolutely impossible for us to hide from the truth that Black and white people in this country have fundamentally different experiences of law enforcement. I admit that I have felt great relief in several vulnerable moments in my own life when I have seen an officer nearby. And I know that that experience is antithetical to the experience that too many Black Americans have when they are interacting with the police. So the question is, America, what are we going to do with this revelation? Last week, I talked about white shame. I talked about how I had heard from so many white people in our own community that they were feeling guilty and shameful, that they had not done more over the course of the years to wake up and to hear the calls that were coming from the Black community for justice. And I myself have also felt some significant shame over the course of the last 2 weeks, because many of us in this community have shouted Black Lives Matter and even been willing to capitalize the B and the L and the M in that statement, aligning ourselves with the movement of Black Lives Matter. But we have failed, by and large, to support the implementation of some of the policies that many in the Black community are calling for, because we have sidestepped the reality that too often our systems of policing endanger lives rather than keeping communities safe. And when we do that, we are not allies. We are not standing together in the fight for justice. So it's become very clear to me over these past agonizing and heart-stretching days that this campaign to defund the police may sound radical, but it is morally right. For years, I have personally shied away from this call, not for ideological reasons. I am fully in support of shifting around budgeting priorities so that the city invests less in policing and more in creating equity for oppressed communities. I want more funding for our public schools and more funding for mental health services and job protections. But until this moment, I have refrained from a full-throated support for defunding the police, really for two reasons. First, feasibility. It did not seem to me that this was a realistic proposal. And I found myself getting caught up again and again in questions of, well, how could that work? And what would it even look like? How could we protect victims of violent crime? How would we still be able to test rape kits? Who would do this life-saving anti-trafficking work? The second reason is semantics. It's about language. The language of defunding made me profoundly uncomfortable. I feared that talking about defunding would elicit a kind of scarcity mentality, that people would focus on what's being taken away from us instead of thinking imaginatively about what we could build instead. And to be really honest, I also feared that this language would be weaponized to create a rift among voters who need to be in coalition with one another in November. But like Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and like many of you, I feel I have grown years in a matter of only days. And I still want to know that in true crisis moments, like after the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue or after the massacre at the Chabad in Poway, when our Jewish community feels achingly vulnerable, I want to know that we will be protected. And I still remain concerned that the language of defunding the police might splinter the very fragile coalition that absolutely must show up enthusiastically in order to keep authoritarianism at bay. But it's very clear to me now that this moment calls for a paradigm shift, that now is precisely the time for people of conscience to come together to transform our justice system into a system that is actually just. It's very clear to me now that this moment is about reimagining community safety, that working to demilitarize and divest from police departments, working to dedicate significant resources to social services, to restorative justice initiatives, to alternatives to incarceration, this could be a once in a lifetime opportunity. And I'm not talking about only once in our lifetime, but once in the lifetime of our nation. This could be our one shot to heal from the generations of damage that our systems have done. In this week's Torah portion, Behalotekha, we're in the second year after leaving Egypt, and the Israelites start to complain. They've been walking now for 2 years, and they're tired and they're fed up. They're supposed to be 3 days away from entering the promised land, but it doesn't matter. They hit a breaking point. These folks are called the complainers, the mitonanim, and they have a litany of complaints. Everything's wrong. The hardship of their journey, the new limitations on sexual relationships, the lack of variety of food for them in the desert. And God is so angry at the mitonanim. God strikes them with fire at the edge of the camp. Oh, and you want meat? I'll give you meat until meat comes out of your nose, it says. Ramban explains that these mitonanim, these complainers, the problem with them is that they feel sorry for themselves, that they can't see all the blessings around them, and instead they're kvetching and complaining and murmuring. I believe it is on us to recognize and distinguish between kvetching and complaining and murmuring because we can't see the abundance of blessings around us, and between stepping forward with sacred discontent because we and those around us are unwilling to live anymore under the thumb of oppression. I believe that there is a sacred form of complaint in which we step forward with our voices and our spirits and demand that we can and we must do better as a nation. The text actually hints that in their complaining in the desert, there was a touch of sacred discontent, and that this, in fact, was the birth of their redemption. They're agitated because they desperately yearned for something better, and they were showing that they were willing to fight for it. It's not every day that you're given 4 or 5 or 6 real crises on top of one another. This is an incredible opportunity. This time of upheaval really demands that we engage in a national cheshbon nefesh, an accounting of the soul of our nation. For generations now, policing and incarceration have been used in this country as violent shortcuts to addressing systemic inequities and intergenerational traumas in the Black community and among people of color to devastating ends. Defeating racism today requires not tweaking and not slowly advancing reform, but transforming our systems. And it will also require transforming our spirits, because this is a struggle not only for a change in policy, but for a change in hearts and minds and souls. Some of you have learned with me before one of my favorite texts, which comes from Rabbi Shalom Noach Berzovsky, the Slonim Rebbe, reflecting on the miracle of post-Shoah Jewish life. He writes that every period in history carries with it a unique mission, that every generation needs to reflect deeply to determine what its mission is. This generation calls us to great things. For reasons we don't fully comprehend, he writes, our generation has been given the opportunity for deep and honest consideration. Today, we are being called to consider the roots of white supremacy, of violence and crime in our society. Today, we are being called to take seriously the call for reparations for past failures. Today, we are being called to engage in courageous, imaginative rethinking of our norms. In the course of days that have felt like years, the call of this moment has become exceedingly clear to me that we must birth a new reality, that now is the moment, that the world that we are creating must be a world that treats every single person as an image of the Holy One, that centers human dignity, that prioritizes healing, and that promises both equity and equality for every single one of us. Shabbat Shalom.